Today I was going to talk about ADHD money management, but I think I touched on that recently. But anyway, after talking with some friends, I felt like I needed to pivot and talk about getting a neurodivergent diagnosis as an adult. Maybe you just found out. Maybe you've known for a few months and you're still trying to figure out what to do with it. Maybe the evaluation is next week and you already half know what it's going to say. Either way, if you're sitting with a recent adult neurodivergent diagnosis, which could be ADHD, autism spectrum, OCD, HSP, or all of the above, what you're probably feeling right now is not one clean thing. It's several things at once. Relief that there is finally an explanation, grief that it took this long, anger maybe, and underneath all of it, a question. Now what? So today we're talking about the late diagnosis, what it actually is to find out as an adult, what the grief is about, and what you do with the information now that you have it. Welcome to Wisdom from the Porch. I'm GP. This is Wisdom from the Porch. Adult neurodivergent diagnosis is not the same experience as a childhood diagnosis. It comes with more history. When a child gets diagnosed, the intervention can begin during development. Systems can be adjusted. Language can be built. When an adult gets diagnosed in their 30s, 40s, 50s, the diagnosis arrives after decades of a different story. Decades of a story that said, this is who you are. Disorganized, irresponsible, too sensitive, unable to follow through, bad in relationships, too much or not enough depending on the day. The story was wrong, but it lived in you for a long time before you found out it was wrong, and it shaped decisions, relationships, careers, and your sense of self in ways that are now real, even if the premise was false. The grief that comes with a late diagnosis is about all of that. The friendships that ended because you didn't have the tools to manage the patterns you didn't know you had. The jobs that fell apart. The relationships where you were told you were too intense or too scattered or too needy, and you believed it. The version of yourself that tried so hard to perform adequately and couldn't sustain it and didn't know why. You weren't lazy. You weren't broken. You were operating without accurate information in a world that didn't have it to give you. And that cost you things you can't get back. That deserves to be grieved. That's real loss, and it needs space before you can move forward. The mistake a lot of people make, understandably, is trying to skip the grief and go straight to solutions. But the grief doesn't disappear because you ignore it. It shows up sideways, as anger at the people who missed it, as self-pity that loops without going anywhere, as a kind of cynicism about whether any of this can actually change. The grief needs to be named and given its proper room. Here's what the grief is not. It's not the end of the conversation, and it's not a sentence. Finding out late means you get to start from here with accurate information, and that's not nothing. So what do you do with this information now? The most common mistake made with a late diagnosis is using it primarily to rewrite the past. Going back through every failure and every relationship and every moment of shame and reinterpreting it through the new lens. That process is useful to a point. Understanding where something came from is genuinely valuable. but it can become a loop where the diagnosis is used to mourn rather than to move. The lens is for understanding, not for permanent residence. The second most common mistake is treating the diagnosis as purely administrative. Getting the paperwork, looking into accommodations, and returning to exactly the same life with no structural changes. The diagnosis is information. Information is only useful when it changes something. What it changes is the question you're allowed to ask. Before the diagnosis, the question was, what's wrong with me that I can't do this? After the diagnosis, the question becomes, given how my brain actually works, what approach would work better here? One question looks for a flaw, the other looks for a solution. You get to use the second question now. 3 things worth doing in the first months after a late neurodivergent diagnosis. First, find at least one person who shares your experience. Not necessarily a therapist, though that helps. A community. A book written by someone who's been where you are. The isolation of a late diagnosis is one of the most painful features, and it's not required. Second, identify the one area of your life where the diagnosis explains the most recurring difficulty and start there. Not everywhere at once. One area. And third, give yourself a specific bounded window of grief. Not suppressing it, processing it. Scheduled, contained, given real space, and then work forward from here. Look, you weren't late to your own life. You had an experience that many people had, and you navigated it with the information and tools you had at the time, and you're still there. The diagnosis is a correction, not a verdict. It's a beginning. So your next one step, write down the one thing the diagnosis explains that you spent the most time blaming yourself for. Just one. That explanation is yours now. You don't have to carry the self-blame version of it anymore. If this helped even a little, you can follow the show, so these conversations are here when you need them. And as always, thank you to Cloud Microphones for supporting these conversations. I'm GP. This has been Wisdom from the Porch. Monday, we're going into something equally real. What happens when the people who love you most refuse to believe the diagnosis you just learned about? Have a great weekend. See you then.